Welcome Bjarke Ingels, please.
Goedenavond, bonsoir. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Not least because, as already mentioned, when me and Julien de Smet, Brussels-born Julien de Smet, when we quit our jobs at OMA almost 12 years ago, we actually went for like 2 weeks and stayed in the attic of his mom's house here in Brussels. So our sort of independent architectural careers were founded here. What I'd like to talk about tonight is to talk about some of the ideas that have been flowing through the office over the last almost 10 years, and try to talk a little bit about what could be the role that architects and architecture could play in society. And this is an image that we designed for a project called 7 New Denmarks, where we try to look at the possibility of organizing all the aspects of daily life in Denmark as a single man-made ecosystem, as a reminder that as architects we can't just be sort of designers of beautiful facades or even expressive, exciting sculptures. We have to become designers of ecosystems where we channel not only the flow of people through our cities and buildings, but also the flow of resources, to diminish the distinction between the man-made and the natural, and try to really look at everything holistically. One of the reasons for this the significance of this sort of expanded role of architecture and the architect, you can find in the atmosphere of this photo. It was taken at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change in Copenhagen 2 years ago. And as you can see on the faces of Merkel and Brown and Obama and especially Sarkozy, it wasn't exactly a party. It was a complete failure. None of the goals that were established for the summit were reached, and the general sort of discussion about sustainability was drowning in this sort of general misconception that sustainability is a question of how much of our current life quality are we prepared to sacrifice in order to afford becoming sustainable. Almost like this Protestant idea that it has to hurt to do good. So when we were invited to compete to design the Danish Pavilion at Shanghai, the Shanghai World Expo in 2010, where the subject for the World Expo was sustainable cities, we asked, what about a different kind of sustainability? What if sustainable cities and buildings could actually increase the quality of life and human enjoyment? So we try to sort of consolidate all of the different elements of Danish city life into the pavilion, becoming sort of a warped streetscape of the streets of Copenhagen, complete with the blue bicycle lanes and the Copenhagen city bikes, the system of free bicycles we've had the last 20 years, allowing people to sort of experience how cool it is to ride your bike through the city, instead of sitting stuck in a traffic jam or looking endlessly for a parking spot. In 2010, there was an 11-day traffic jam in Shenzhen in China. So some poor bastard was stuck in his car for 11 days. That's like the opposite of human enjoyment. Meanwhile, in Copenhagen, almost 40% of the Copenhageners commute by bicycle, so they're never stuck in traffic. So you could really bicycle through the pavilion, also through the exhibition itself, making it the ideal museum for impatient people, because you could actually bicycle through the whole thing without missing anything in just 2 minutes. Expanding on the roof. Also, the first project that Julien and I designed actually was the Copenhagen Harbor Bath in Copenhagen, celebrating the fact that in Copenhagen our port water has become so clean that you can actually swim in it, so it sort of seamlessly extends public life into the port. So to grant the Chinese visitors this experience, we created a harbor bath at the heart of the pavilion, allowing the visitors to experience how clean, if not how cold, Danish harbor water is. And finally, sort of trying to see how can we actually attract the Chinese to come and experience on their own bodies these various elements of Danish city life that increases life quality. We started looking for common denominators between Denmark and China. And we discovered that in the Chinese public school curriculum, they have 3 fairy tales by Hans Christian Andersen. So all 1.3 billion Chinese actually grew up with the story of the Little Mermaid. So we proposed to move her to China for 6 months. Not a copy, but the actual mermaid. When the Danish Nationalist Party, which would be the Danish equivalent of the Tea Party in America, this sort of bastion of intolerance, when they heard about it, they tried to pass a law specifically against moving the mermaid. And for the first time in my life, I was invited to go and speak at the Danish Parliament to argue her case. As you can see, we got her. Then we had to get her through Chinese customs and into the pavilion. Actually, back in Denmark, in the absence of the mermaid, we invited the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei to make an art installation. And what he did was that he installed a Chinese surveillance camera in the pavilion. It's the same camera that the Chinese state has installed in front of his studio. But this one is transmitting an image, a live footage, to an installation he put in the water in Copenhagen, where she normally sits, so that the tourists going in vain could see that she was okay. But as a sort of political statement on sort of freedom and liberty of speech, it also became a loophole in the Great Firewall of China, because for 6 months it was the only uncensored TV feed from China to the rest of the world. So basically the Danish pavilion in Shanghai became our first sort of architectural manifestation of what we like to call hedonistic sustainability, this idea that that sustainable cities and buildings can really increase our quality of life. Being in China at the same time working with the Expo, we got invited to compete for a competition to design the headquarters for the Shenzhen energy company. And Shenzhen is the most sort of industrious region in the world, 14 million people. It was the first special economic development zone of China, and probably half the stuff you own has been manufactured in Shenzhen. So they have a very big energy bill. And we thought it could be interesting. It's essentially a big corporate office building. So we thought it could be interesting to look at the energy consumption. And this is, Shenzhen is a humid subtropical climate. So one of the main dilemmas for workspaces is to maximize views and daylight, but also to minimize glare and thermal exposure and air conditioning. So basically we designed the facade of the building as this sort of pleated dress, almost like a sort of zigzag that basically blocks all of the direct sunshine from the south and opens up to the north. So when you look north, you have a sort of complete panoramic view and abundance of daylight. And when you look south, you see these like bamboo veneer walls washed in daylight. From the outside, it becomes almost like this sort of Issey-Miyake fabric. Within the logic, we can sort of open up larger pieces, but still facing north. The upper part is the sort of the sky lobby for the executive wing. At the bottom, you have one of the entrances. So there's like a certain pliability or flexibility in this very basic principle. So basically this like simple idea, there's no technology, there's no moving parts. It's just simply the way the facade is manufactured and oriented. It actually reduces the thermal exposure with 30% and the resulting air conditioning. So you can say, in a way, what makes the building look different is actually what makes it perform different. And the way what actually reduces the energy consumption is what gives it a certain character in terms of architecture. So obviously, like China is quite different in terms of density than Copenhagen. So this is like our first chance of actually working with an urban high-rise. A year and a half ago, we opened an office in New York, and as a result, we're getting more work in North America. This is downtown Vancouver in Canada. And if you look at the downtown of Vancouver is this interesting urban experiment. It even named a form of urbanism called Vancouverism, which is like very high density residential city core. So all of these high rises are not office buildings, they're actually the places where the Vancouverists live. Vancouver has been experiencing like an incredible boom the last sort of decades. Basically, when Great Britain had to give back Hong Kong to China, all the Hong Kong Chinese sort of bought a sort of insurance, so they got real estate in Vancouver. So if everything would go like haywire, they could actually just stay in Vancouver. Gradually, they came back, but they somehow opened Vancouver to become like a main gate to North America from China. So every year, there's 35,000 affluent Chinese moving into a city the size of Brussels. So this is like Granville Bridge, the main bridge that reaches downtown. And here the city is planning 2 high-rises of 500 feet. One on city land and one on the land of our client. Vancouver, because of the Chinese immigration, has one of the most valuable real estate markets in the world. If you take an 85 square meter apartment and you move it 1 floor up, it increases in value with at least $15,000. So 20 floors is like another 300,000 for the same apartment. And finally, there's a nice little park next to the site where the city doesn't want the development to cast shadows. So we started mapping the site, and you can see it's a pretty tortured site. You have the highway that sort of forks in and shreds the site into triangles. Our client had been working on the site for like a year when he hired us to look at it. So we started mapping the different constraints. There's like a setback from the sidewalks, there's setbacks from the elevated highways. There's another setback, a 30-meter setback, because like the city wants to ensure that nobody is living looking straight out at the highway itself, which almost wipe out all of the buildable area. And finally, there's the park. So we're left with like a tiny triangle of 600 square meters, which is almost too small for a tower. So we started thinking like, essentially like the distance to the highway from the apartments is a minimum distance. It's a question of ensuring that people don't look at the cars. So we were thinking, when you get like 30 meters up in the air, we can actually come back out. Our client still owns the land, and essentially sort of maximize the amount of the nicest apartments. So it's almost like this wedge coming out through this spaghetti of traffic. So as you drive over Granville Bridge, it becomes almost like pulling a curtain aside, sort of welcome to Vancouver. And sort of moving around the building, the sort of play of light and shadow adds a level of poetry to something that is essentially like a highly pragmatic real estate project. Also, when you look at the skyline of Vancouver, it's really like One of the Boys, but it has this sort of feminine silhouette to it. It actually reminded us a lot of the Flatiron building in New York. The Flatiron was a product of this moment in Manhattan urban development where the real estate value had gotten so high, and the advent of steel structure and elevators suddenly made a seemingly like unusable site into a striking urban development, and it became so striking that it's now the name of a whole neighborhood in New York. And of course, our building has a lot of similarities, except we've nicknamed our building the Fat Iron because it sort of bulges out above the waistline. It's sort of moving into zoning this April. Back in Scandinavia, one of the ideas that we've been developing, trying to sort of use practical means to achieve sort of synergies and increase the quality of living, both sort of environmentally and economically and socially of a neighborhood, is this idea of architectural alchemy. The idea that by mixing different ingredients that you would normally keep separate, you can actually increase, create, if not gold, then at least sort of added value. The first time we sort of coined the phrase was for the project called The Mountain in Copenhagen, that essentially combines an apartment building and turns it into like a mountain of houses with gardens, providing the local inhabitants this sort of suburban lifestyle, you know, a big garden where the kids can run out and play, but in, you know, with a penthouse view and in the middle of the dense urban context. This sort of merging of the suburban and the urban is made possible by putting all of the apartments on a man-made mountain of parking. It's a parking that serves the whole neighborhood. It also has a funicular elevator, this standard product from Switzerland, that gives access to all the apartments. And the whole parking is naturally ventilated and naturally illuminated by cladding it in a perforated aluminum facade. It's basically the cheapest facade you can put on a building. But because the holes look dark on the bright aluminum background, from a distance, this very inexpensive facade turns into a gigantic urban artwork, like a rasterized image. We commissioned a Japanese photographer from Himalaya to give us this beautiful photo of Mount Everest that essentially sort of, again, like what makes the parking naturally ventilated and naturally illuminated is also what turns it into this sort of incredibly huge urban artwork. This idea, working with the same client, we took you know, one step further in this development on the extreme outskirts of Copenhagen. It's this whole new neighborhood. The lake represents the end of Copenhagen. The city is planning this dense sort of urban master plan with perimeter blocks, almost as downtown Copenhagen, but floating in the middle of the green. And we thought, if you're going to be sort of building from scratch, if you're going to be doing an entire city from nothing, how do you sort of impregnate it with the diversity and the surprises and the sort of different experiences that characterizes a historical city? What you typically do in Denmark is that you would design a lot of identical apartments, and then you put on different facades to give it this sort of a cosmetic illusion of diversity. We thought, what about real diversity? What about the fact that shops and offices, they actually like to be close to the customers, so we put them on the ground. Apartments go on top, but because residential space is less deep than commercial space, we suddenly get some space for little gardens in front of these townhouses, and maybe even a small public path. Then we add another layer of more classic apartments, and finally penthouse townhouses. Then the master plan, so now we created this layer cake where each program gravitates towards its favorite position in the vertical mix. The master plan asks for a shortcut through the block, so we turn it into a figure 8 that creates these little plazas that sort of expand the sidewalk into these urban plazas around the building. Finally, shops and offices, just like in Shenzhen, they like daylight, but they hate sunshine, and they spend energy on cooling. So to the south, we push them down to the ground, and to the north, we lift them up into the sunshine and the views. And in reverse, in the southwest corner, we push the corner down, opening up the entire courtyard and the gardens in there for the views and the daylight next to the landscape. So this sort of optimization of the conditions for the different programmatic parts distorts the figure 8 into this sort of a sloping landscape of paths, and actually creates a public passage that expands the urban realm all the way into the building. Basically, this project was built right before the global financial crisis and the complete collapse of the Danish real estate market. So you can see a lot of the neighbors haven't really arrived. So like in a way, this trying to increase the urban diversity within our block turned out to be a fortunate idea. So right now, you really have this sort of extreme clash of life forms. The neighbors are cattle. But what happened was that this sort of idea of architectural alchemy does not only allow us to optimize the conditions for the individual programs, like in this case you can see, like by lifting up the townhouses on top of the offices, we actually bring them up into the sunlight and the views. The offices become like a 4-story office building facing north. But it also allows for the possibility for spontaneous social encounters, or getting to know your neighbors, or creating a sense of a community or a neighborhood that is traditionally restricted to occurring at street level, is now invited to invade the three-dimensional space of the urban block. So the 8 House is not just some like nice facade or an expressive sculptural building. It's a three-dimensional urban condition that sort of carves out different niches for various forms of social life throughout the three-dimensional space of the city block itself. Also, we did this idea of the pathway to create like possibilities for spontaneous encounters between the residents. This is the place where the 8 crosses itself, and you have the passage through the building. In this place, we also concentrated all of the amenities. So all of the social spaces for the building and for the inhabitants are consolidated around this vertical atrium, and is tying the entire building into a single social tower or void all the way to the top. But so like, we did this idea for the residents, but as a side effect, you can see, unlike Brussels, Copenhagen is completely flat as a pancake. We have no landscape. We have like no amazing hills where you can enjoy the view of your city. As a side effect, this has become a place where people in Copenhagen actually go on the weekend and go for a walk to sort of enjoy the view of their town. The overall principle of the architecture is also that this idea of synergy, that each program supports the other. So the facades of the offices become the handrails of the path. The actual handrail becomes the street lights. So each function is sort of helping the other one in this sort of extreme collaboration between the different elements of the building. You can say like a lot of these projects actually have a very significant engagement with the public and the public realm, even though they're actually privately commissioned for private clients. But in some projects, the public participation is really part of the brief. We did a competition some years ago for the City Hall of Tallinn. Tallinn is this beautiful UNESCO World Heritage medieval downtown. The existing city hall was put in like 11 different buildings inside the medieval city, and they wanted to consolidate it into a new town hall. And we thought it could be interesting to sort of undo the traditional dichotomy of having the public outside and the politicians inside. So we decided to sort of hover the entire city hall above a continuous public domain that sort of expands the town square into this, what we call the public service marketplace, where the citizens are free to enter and engage with the public servants, also see the politicians at work. We call it the public village because it's designed that each department has its own building, but they overlap to create a continuous public institution that still has the porosity to allow daylight and views and air to enter deep into the floor plans. Finally, in the background, you can see the old City Hall of Tallinn. It has a spire, like this traditional European town hall. And in the master plan, they anticipated that the new city hall should have some kind of a tower. So we decided to put the city council inside the tower. They have this giant tall ceiling space where the roof or the ceiling is created as a giant mirror. So when the politicians have to make difficult decisions, all they have to do is like look up, and then they get this sort of perfect periscope overview of the city they're messing with. As a side effect, when the angry citizens gather to demonstrate, they get like a perfect bird's eye view of the city council. They can see if politicians are sleeping or doing dirty deals or playing Angry Birds on their iPhones. So we call this idea the democratic periscope that combines political overview with public insight. And to our great fortune, the City Council liked it, and we're breaking ground this spring. So you can say like the City Hall, of course it's a very significant building. It has a lot of like really practical functions, but also maybe, and perhaps more importantly, it's also a very important symbolic value that it provides in projecting, you know, this like Estonia is a former Soviet democracy that now really wants to sort of advocate transparency and and public engagement in the political process. So for them, the democratic periscope really captures this idea in the public village. Another project we did that is quite small as a building, but has a very significant sort of a capacity to project an identity, was that we were invited to do a competition for the National Gallery of Greenland. As you might know, Greenland is part of the Royal Danish Kingdom, but they recently acquired independent rule. And the first public institution they're going to be building with independence is going to be the National Gallery for contemporary Greenlandic art. And it's located on the waterfront of Nuuk in this like incredibly beautiful landscape. Like this sort of very exciting rocky topography. And here in the background you can see these charming housing buildings built in the 70s by the Danish, meant to house fishermen, like moving them from their villages into these like very efficient functionalist Danish apartments that completely ignore the landscape. We try to sort of come up with a counter architecture, an architecture that is really sort of impregnated and imprinted by the landscape. So essentially we chose a circular building because like all Arctic vernacular typologies are circular. So basically it's also the smallest possible building that can create a protected sculptural courtyard. And this perfect circle melts and follows the specific landscape, which also opens up the interior-oriented courtyard to embrace the view of the water. And being sort of protected on the perimeter and open at the heart, we also allows us to push it all the way into the water's edge. Following this melted geometry, the building sort of softly opens up, inviting people to enter. You have a sloping picture gallery that brings you to a series of big project spaces in a circle on the ground. But maybe one of the main points is that as soon as you enter into the eye of the storm, if you like, you can see the melted geometry frames a view of the Greenlandic landscape with the mountains, the water, the icebergs in the winter, the Greenlandic flora, the Greenlandic artworks with the sculptures and the paintings inside and outside. And all of the Danish heritage is completely eliminated from view. So it's almost like a sort of a censored oasis of Greenlandicness in a city completely contaminated by Danish social housing. So these projects, they deal like very significantly with public participation, but sort of addressed from our point of view. In one project, we really try to almost like surrender authorship to the public in this sort of extreme version. This is a photo taken from our street in Copenhagen, where our office is. Some of you might remember some years ago there was a Muhammad cartoon crisis in Denmark. A large provincial newspaper commissioned 10 cartoonists in some kind of misconceived crusade for liberty of speech, proving that in Denmark we can make fun of everything, including the Prophet Muhammad, pissing off like 1 billion Muslims all across the world. This is in Syria. They also burnt like little cardboard figures of the Danish Prime Minister, which is an honor normally reserved for the President of the United States. And also in our local neighborhood, this is the street where our office is. You can see our office in the background. And this is like a group of young men from our neighborhood. We live in the most sort of ethnically diverse neighborhood in Denmark. And we were invited at this time, so it became clear that Copenhagen is no longer this sort of homogeneous Danish culture. It's really like a part of the globalized community. This neighborhood here has more than 60 different nationalities living right next to this urban space. And we did a competition to design a mile-long urban space. And I'll only explain one part of it, because it was clear that this project was going to be all about creating a sense of ownership and integration and belonging to this like incredibly diverse group of Copenhageners. So we divided it into what we call sort of the red square. It's currently under construction. It's opening this summer. but this is actually a photo from an airplane. The red square has these different shades of red indicating different activities, different kinds of pavements. The black market, where everything is black, and the green park, where even the pavement is green. And within this very simple urban layout, rather than plastering it with sort of Danish design, we reached out to the local community and asked everybody through local media, through like an internet site, through a big mailbox and through some local meetings, asked people to nominate elements from their other home country, in a way almost considering all of planet Earth as a giant urban laboratory where everybody is constantly all over the Earth conducting experiments in how to best inhabit our planet, how to best sort of increase the quality for human life. And essentially tapping into this and asking tapping into the local knowledge of the global residents. And the main idea is that we don't eat Chinese food or Indian food to be nice to the Indians. It has nothing to do with political correctness. It's because sometimes we really crave Indian food. And it's the same, we don't put a Moroccan fountain to be nice to the Moroccans. It's because the Moroccans have an amazing sort of culture for architectural water features. So we're actually constructing this Moroccan fountain in Copenhagen. There's like a mussel beach that incorporates elements from Venice and LA with elements from Thailand and China. And this sort of outrageous Estonian swing. We're actually getting some liability difficulties with the swing, so it might not make it in the end. There's a slide from Ukraine. It's from Chernobyl, so we had to make a copy because the original is radioactive. The sign on the red square is the sign from the red square. And even if you take bollards, something simple as bollards from Ghana and put them in a Scandinavian context, they become these incredibly exotic objects. Of course, there's a lot of bicycle parking. This is Copenhagen. So we went on this safari in bicycle parking, a nice one from Canada with a bicycle pump in it. And when you look at benches, for instance, it becomes almost like a social study in sort of local behavior from Spain and Mexico. This S-curved bench that allows you to look the person you're sitting next to straight into the eyes. From Belgium, one that does the opposite. Everyone is looking away from each other. So in many ways, it becomes this sort of like quite an exotic exploration of this sort of global diversity of different elements. A plaything from Tokyo out of glass fiber, a giant octopus. Snow cannons from Sweden, bird cages from Holland. We found palm trees in China that naturally grow in the Danish climate, even with snow. So this is like without any artificial enhancement, naturally growing palm trees in Copenhagen. Finally, one of the main elements that remind you that you're actually visiting a foreign culture is strangely, or like obviously, the advertisement. So as a series of like big, beautiful, sculptural, colorful lamps, we have recreated these big neon signs that advertise stuff you can't buy in Denmark. My favorite one is this one. It's the advertisement for a dentist in Qatar. But also, of course, on the red square, we have this sort of assemblage of communist and Soviet advertisement. The Moscovite was one of the worst cars ever produced. So as I mentioned, we got the job and we are opening this summer. And I think in many ways, rather than sort of, we were actually expecting this to be, we sort of decided to suspend aesthetic judgment and just go with the sort of extreme diversity. But strangely, it's actually become like quite beautiful in a way, and much not so like crazy as we imagined. And in many ways, I think rather than sort of perpetuating a petrified perception of Copenhagen as being this sort of homogeneous culture, it really truly reveals the cultural diversity of contemporary Copenhagen. That brings me to the sort of last category of ideas that I'd like to talk about, which is the sort of relationship between infrastructure and social programs. And And like almost like as a law of nature, the infrastructure of the industry of the past has a tendency to be sort of reinvented or reappropriated to become the infrastructure or framework for cultural and social institutions. At the scale of a city, this is Park City in Utah. It used to be a mining town. And actually, when the silver mines dried out, the first ski lifts in the world were actually repurposed mining lifts that were used to bringing silver down from the mountain. And suddenly, when there was no more silver, they started dragging ski runners up on the hill instead. And the plumes of smoke have become sort of plumes of snow cannons. Park City now is also the home of the Sundance Film Festival, and it's become this sort of cultural mecca in the middle of the mountains. In Park City, the Kimball Art Center is actually a refurbished garage, a car garage that is now an art gallery. And in the background, you see the Coalition building. It was the mining building. It was back in history where the silver came via these lifts that then became ski lifts into to town and got unloaded onto the trains. So it was like the tallest sort of building in Park City, as the sort of landmark of Park City as an industrial mining town. It burned down in the 80s, and now all of Park City is just 2 floors. And right here in the middle of, and also where people arrive from the mountains and come to town, in this sort of pivoting point, the Kimball Art Center sits, and they wanted to expand to create, to come like more of an actual art museum. So we decided to concentrate the learning center in the existing garage, and then to put all of the new functions in a very small footprint that actually becomes almost like a little tower. It has 2 main art galleries, one with artificial light that we nest into the sloping site that's aligned with Main Street, and then the upper gallery that is turned to sort of address people coming from out of town, almost like a friendly building that turns its head to sort of welcome visitors to Park City. And it has like exactly the same proportion, so it almost like awakens the ghost of the Coalition building. And then the question is like, how do you sort of integrate, in a way, like contemporary architecture in this sort of, in the raw charm of an industrial sort of mining and wood logging town? The immigrants were mostly Scandinavian, and they brought with them this sort of log construction technique that they were using with interlocking logs that they were using for the mines and also for their houses. And in Utah, it has like turned into this like local tectonic. For this is a silo, and even the Navajo Indians use like these solid logs to create like complex shapes. And finally, the Pacific Railroad used to have a train line going across the Salt Lake, and the piles that the railroad was sitting on has been marinating in the salt water for decades and has now become this like incredibly rich and dense material. So we were proposing to take all of these different elements of the infrastructure of the past of Park City and really use it to realize this, this new building. So basically the thickness of the massive wood allowed us to sort of create the complex geometry in a completely natural way. We literally built the architectural model exactly the same way that the museum is going to be built. And also today you can say like in modern architecture, because of the complex sections and because of the thermal breaks in architecture, what the building is made of and what it sort of seems to be is a cosmetic veneer that is applied to the outside and the inside. In this case, it's really like a raw material sculpture where the thickness is the strength and the insulation and the material finish of the art museum. Finally, the Coalition building used to have this sort of steel facility inside, wrapped in a wooden frame. And because of the climate concerns for the artworks, the 2 galleries are actually made with the steel structure with complete climate control. And then the wooden frame incorporates the lobbies, the restaurants, and all of the circulation into this sort of in-between zone. So here you would see the sort of the view from Main Street, the sort of the building turning its head, looking up and down Main Street. When you enter into the building, you have the lower galleries nested into the side. You come up to this big generous space in the middle that sort of expands out to the outdoor terrace. And coming back inside, you can follow the sort of wood logs as the steps that take you to the big generous gallery at the top with daylight and views. That also becomes essentially the first thing you see when you arrive to Park City in the future is going to be whatever's going on in the art exhibition above and below. So in many ways, like you can say, like the new Kimball Art Museum, by re-invoking the ghost of the Coalition building, it sort of really sort of continues this legacy of what used to be the landmark for the industry now is the landmark for the cultural life of Park City. So you know, like there's a lot of examples of how like decommissioned infrastructure can be reinvented to have a cultural program. One example is a project we're doing in north of Copenhagen. This is the castle of Shakespeare's Prince Hamlet, the Kronborg Castle. It was recently turned into a UNESCO World Heritage. It's becoming increasingly impossible to do anything in Europe because of UNESCO. But in this case, the Danish Maritime Museum was located inside the castle. And because when Hamlet was around, there was no Maritime Museum, they had to kick out the castle and proposed to put it inside this decommissioned dry dock where they used to make ships. It's decommissioned, so it's full of water right now. Also, the museum was going to be twice as big as the dock itself, so we were almost going to create this claustrophobic underground museum. And we thought instead of drowning the dock in museum program, it would be interesting to keep it as a giant public void, sunken 8 meters below the surface of the sea. Also, because of the bad state of the dock, we would have to reinforce the dock walls from the inside or from the outside to take the pressure from the surrounding soil and water. So we thought, if we're going to make new dock walls anyway, why don't we sort of leave enough space so we can fit the museum between the new and the old dock walls, in a way turning the museum brief inside out, turning the dock into a giant courtyard surrounded by museum. It also undid this dilemma in the brief that UNESCO said that the museum had to be completely invisible. We weren't allowed to stick as much as a meter out of the ground. Of course, the museum and the sponsors wanted some kind of architectural masterpiece that could attract people to go and check out the museum. And by turning it into a void, turning it inside out, we could actually combine the need for invisibility with the desire for exposure. All we had to do was design a series of bridges. One of the bridges slopes down and takes people into the museum itself. It has museum program inside. One bridge that connects to the castle has an auditorium. One bridge that stops the water from coming in has a restaurant. And these bridges also bring daylight into the museum, so even though it's completely underground and underwater, it's actually flooded with daylight and views to the outside. So when we submitted the competition, we thought it was going to be uphill, because there was one condition in the brief, and that was that you weren't allowed to build outside the dock. And essentially, like at least literally, the entire museum is around the dock. But the jury liked the idea, and we won the proposal. But then something bizarre happened. The Danish Architects Association, which is my union, they sued the client for having chosen a proposal that broke one of the conditions of the brief. This, of course, made me seriously reconsider my membership of the Danish Architects Association. But they didn't dispute that it was a good idea to do it. They just said that they weren't allowed to choose it. Happily, at this point, our client has gotten so convinced by the idea that they decided to cancel the competition and hire us as their architects. So now we started this sort of surreal construction process where the main challenge is actually to stop, not to keep the building standing, but to stop it from sailing away, essentially, because it's like a giant concrete boat suppressed underwater. And paradoxically, it's actually the tallest building we've built in Denmark, but just from zero and down. So if you can sort of reinvent existing infrastructure for cultural and social programs. Of course, you can also do the opposite. We did a project for an art museum in a sculpture park in a beautiful landscape next to the river with some existing heritage and a lot of sculptures. And the client has a great collection of sculptures. So currently he has like a relatively small sculpture park. He wanted to build the museum, but also he purchased all of the green area as a new land purchase, and he wanted to expand the park, and he was going to screw up his circulation. Is going to be full of dead ends. So we basically proposed that perhaps the museum could solve this challenge and actually become a bridge that would sort of turn the entire museum experience and sculpture park experience into an integrated loop. The site is very steep on one side and flat on the other side. So the museum itself sort of incorporates this transition and creating a series of galleries, like a big project room with sidelight and views, a skylit gallery, a media gallery, and a painting gallery. And of course in the middle there's like very specific space that connects the galleries. There's a single like window that turns from skylight into a panoramic view. And basically as you approach the museum, you enter and you have this stack of galleries. You follow the paintings up the slope, and where the building turns, it becomes like this fanning stair that connects all the three galleries to the main project room. And as you move from the skylit gallery, the skylights really sort of turn and becomes the panoramic view of the existing mill on the site before you continue into the sculpture park and on your way. So in many ways the museum becomes this sort of hybrid between a museum, a bridge, and a sculpture in its own right. You can almost see the museum as one of the sculptures in the sculpture park. And depending on where you experience it from, it really changes character and appearance. So that brings me to so essentially again like a piece of infrastructure, a bridge that doubles as a cultural program, but where the sort of the dual purpose is actually integrated from the beginning. And that brings us to the largest project that we've undertaken so far, and that in many ways is similar in scope to the Brussels 2040 proposal that was discussed this morning. We were commissioned by the 10 municipalities of metropolitan Copenhagen to look at a master plan reaching into 2050, but looking at the immediate impact of making a new train line that would connect all the different cities. And we thought, like, if we're looking at the future of Copenhagen, we can't just focus on Copenhagen or even metropolitan Copenhagen. We can't even just focus on Denmark, because right on the other side of the water we have southern Sweden, connected by the Öresund Bridge over the last like 11 or 12 years. And it also, you have like all of the most sort of economically prosperous regions in Scandinavia. And by adding just a 5-kilometer long bridge, we can actually turn it all into a single binational metropolitan loop where no area is further away than 40 minutes by public transportation. And the idea is that this is not just an infrastructure for like trains and buses and highways. It's also an infrastructure for waste management, for water management, like a smart grid that combines the hydroelectricity of Sweden with the wind power of Denmark. It also connects all of the most prosperous businesses in the region. And by actually proposing to not make like the master plan for the Danish capital, but to really consider the whole region as a binational metropolitan zone, we can also introduce pink in a flag for the first time. It has the exact same size as the San Francisco Bay Area, so as an urban region it's actually a quite well-known quantity. And the main idea is that really all of the different infrastructures, you can say like typically these infrastructural investments like energy, like waste, water treatment, public transportation, highways, are these huge elements on the public budget, but quite often they appear as gray areas on the map. They have this single purpose and they don't really contribute to the cities they form part of. In this case, the idea is that all of the different activities are actually sort of nested into a very sort of dense and consolidated element, making the this infrastructure really an integrated part of the daily life of the new neighborhoods. And as a first example of this development, we're doing a project in Copenhagen. It was a competition for a waste-to-energy power plant that is right in the middle of the city of Copenhagen. Essentially, we only landfill 4% of our waste in Denmark. 42% gets recycled, and 54% is used as fuel to create heat and electricity. Essentially, as a thumb rule, a typical bag of 3 kilos of household waste turns into 4 hours of domestic electricity and 5 hours of heating. Seen as a resource, a ton of trash is almost the same as 2 barrels of oil. As a result, 97% of the Copenhageners spend no energy on heating. They get district heating as a byproduct from the power production. So even though we're a cold country, we get our heat as a byproduct from this power production. But of course, this is an old tested technology. It started in the 50s because of space. We didn't have enough space for landfills, and gradually it has been more and more utilized, and it's like Denmark has become world leaders in waste to energy. But these factories are big, ugly, boxy factories. They cast shadows on the neighbors, they block the views. This is going to be the tallest and biggest building in all of Copenhagen, dwarfing the historical skyline. It's right next to the Copenhagen Marina, and it's right next to where the local boys go water skiing. So we thought, like, how can this not be just another gray area on the city map, but actually contribute to the city of Copenhagen? And speaking of skiing, Copenhageners love to ski, Danes love to ski, but we have no mountains whatsoever. But we have mountains of trash. So we thought people happily go for 5 hours by bus to this small ski resort in southern Sweden. And because of the size of the factory, we can actually put a similar size ski resort on the roof of our building. So we know how big the buildings are, so we wrap them in this sort of minimal envelope. And instead of doing a traditional visitor center where school teachers drag the children to force them to listen to how waste turns into energy, there's an elevator that takes you to a green, a blue, and a black ski slope. So all winter you will be able to ski in Copenhagen. Miraculously, we won the competition based on this idea. So from 2016, you should start looking out for Danish skiers in alpine skiing competitions, because now we can actually practice at home. The envelope of this waste-to-energy power plant is made as this sort of stacks of giant planters that filter daylight into the workspaces. We use natural ventilation and natural daylight. You see, like, in many ways, this idea of the ecosystem, cities as man-made ecosystems that I showed in the beginning, is actually coming very close to completion in this case, because, like, not only do we locally harvest the rainwater, you have the filtering in the facades, we use the daylight, we have the natural ventilation, but also together with the city of Copenhagen, we form an entire ecosystem of waste, heat, and electricity. Finally, this is going to be the cleanest waste-to-energy power plant in the world. We've sort of refined the technology so far that the smoke coming out of the chimney is completely non-toxic. It's so well filtered and the combustion temperature is so well controlled. But it still emits some CO2, quite little compared to a normal power plant, but still there's some CO2. So together with Realities United from Berlin, we developed the mouth of the chimney as this chamber that slowly fills with CO2, and when there's 100 kilos, it puffs a gigantic smoke ring. Of course, we liked it as the ultimate artistic expression of hedonistic sustainability, that what used to be a problem, the chimney, is now something playful that puffs smoke rings and where you can ski on the power plant. But more importantly, one of the main drivers of behavioral change is knowledge, that if people don't know, they can't act. CO2 emissions is so abstract that nobody really understands what it is. It's like this uncountable thing, coming out of the chimneys or whatever, out of the exhaust pipes of our cars. So, if my nephews ask me what's a ton of CO2, I don't have a clue. But in 2016, all you have to do in Copenhagen is count the smoke rings. And when you've counted 10 smoke rings, we just emitted 1 ton of CO2. So it's like also as an interesting side effect, you can say like the waste to energy power plant is like, it's not only economically and environmentally sustainable that it actually turns waste into a resource, it's also socially sustainable that it turns a power plant into a public park at the heart of the city. This idea of like stealing, in this case we're sort of bringing the ski slopes to the factory. Shortly after winning the project for the waste to energy power plant, we won another project for a ski hotel in Levi in Lapland in Finland, where we designed the whole hotel as this master plan where no surface has a slope of less than 7%, which is the ideal minimum for both skis and snowboards. So you won't have to walk anywhere. You can ski in and ski out. And even people living in the penthouse and also everybody else can take the main elevator to the roof of the different hotel buildings and ski straight into the ski slope. So it's almost like taking the idea back from the power plant and back into its natural habitat. This one is actually starting construction this summer. So as a last statement, I very often get the comments based on the fact that most of our work so far has been realized in the context of Copenhagen, and everybody's saying, this is only possible in socialist Scandinavia, where even the developers don't care about profit, and where the state pays architects to lose competitions or whatever. Like there's a lot of stories about Scandinavia, but actually, the reason we opened an office in New York is that a year and a half ago we got, or like two and a half years ago now, we got approached by a Manhattan-based real estate developer, and basically everybody said that there are no worse developers than Manhattan real estate developers. Our client actually has a house in South Beach, in West Palm Beach in Florida, and there's sharks in the water. But he says he's not afraid of swimming because being a New York real estate developer, he gets professional courtesy from the sharks. But they asked us to try to look at this piece of land on the west side waterfront of Manhattan. It's in Hell's Kitchen, and it's actually it's quite far away from the Central Park, and it's actually surrounded by a waste management facility to the south and a power plant to the north. Not combined, but sandwiched around our building. And then the West Side Highway taking off. So even though we have beautiful views of the water, we have ideal sunlight conditions, we're in the middle of this very sort of industrial neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen. So we thought, in a way, like having spent 10 years of our career trying to escape the tyranny of the typology of the Copenhagen courtyard building. This is the courtyard building where my dad grew up and where my grandparents lived. This sort of typical Copenhagen courtyard. And in many ways, it is at the architectural scale what Central Park is at an urban scale, like it's an urban oasis surrounded by density. So we thought, what happens if you try to crossbreed a Manhattan skyscraper with the Copenhagen courtyard? Or essentially, what would a Courtscraper look like? So we placed the courtyard right next to the existing buildings, the power plant, the waste management facility, and then this residential tower called the Helena. It's not only owned by our client, it's also named after his daughter. So we try to preserve the views. And then to achieve Manhattan density, we lift up the northeast corner to 460 feet, still making sure that you get daylight throughout the day, basically like from the in the middle of the morning to noon and all the way to the sunset. and you also get all of the views of the Hudson River. So it becomes this sort of quite sort of striking new silhouette on the west side waterfront of Manhattan. Essentially, the sort of extreme merge of two different typologies. The geometry is this sort of hyperbolic paraboloid, where like all of the cross sections are actually straight, but it creates this sort of saddle shape. From the east, it almost looks like a spire, and of course, all of the apartments that face the sloping roof have these terraces that are sunken into the roof plane, and because of the extreme asymmetry, it goes from 1 meter to 150 meters. All of the courtyard and all of the apartments, even the ones facing the interior courtyard, have views over this little central park over the Hudson to Hoboken and New Jersey. So you can say, like, to me, maybe just double check that the sound is on. To me, architecture is definitely an art form, and for all art that really interests me is art that sort of expands your perception of the world or of life or society, that somehow it reveals elements of everyday that you might not capture normally. And it could be like a piece of music that captures sounds that you would normally disregard as noise and actually shows you potential for harmony in these like soundscapes. And after having gotten your perception expanded by, for instance, a piece of art or a painting or a piece of photography or film or whatever, you won't be able to perceive the world without noticing these elements that have been brought to life through your expanded perception. And in a way, it's the same in architecture. That, you know, society is organized and channeled through all these immaterial structures. It can be like social structures, economical structures, political structures, cultural structures, logistical structures that flow through society, and because they're immaterial and dynamic, they're invisible to the human eye. But as you know, as they evolve, as life in the city evolves, these structures evolve, and whenever you have to do a building or intervene in an urban space or design a landscape, you have the possibility to just, you know, preconceive something and like have the risk of like inhibiting the flow of these structures. You won't see, or you won't hear, or you won't observe how life has changed. But you also have the potential to really analyze what's happening and almost create, you know, the framework, draw the contours or the outline of where life is going, and in a way sort of make visible through architecture something that would otherwise be unseen. And, you know, the skyline of Manhattan is a product of, you know, finance, industry, commerce. But over the last 10 years, they've gone through this incredibly interesting urban development where the piers of the waterfront that until very recently were just like highways and industry are actually turning into the Hudson River Park. They have a plan to plant 1 million trees. They already planted like, I think, 700,000 of them over the last 10 years. They made more bicycle lanes with the help of the Danish urbanist Jan Gehl, who's also here tonight. More bicycle lanes than we have in Copenhagen now. They've pedestrianized Broadway and major parts of Times Square. So this like unimaginable sort of enterprise to make Manhattan a more lively and habitable city. And West 57, in a way, captures this development and shows how this rejuvenation of the urban space, making New York a more livable city, is starting to invade the city fabric itself and is starting to nest oases at the heart of the previously deep city blocks of Manhattan. So we got the foundation permits and are breaking ground in May. So with a little luck, this could be the view driving up and down the West Side Highway in 3.5 years.
Yeah, I'm out at Brooklyn, now I'm down in Tribeca, right next to De Niro, but I'll be hood forever, I'm the new Sinatra, and since I made it here, I can make it anywhere, yeah, they love me everywhere, I used to cop in Harlem, all of my Dominicanos right there up on Broadway, brought me back to that McDonald's, took it to my stash spot, 560 State Street, catch me in the kitchen like a Simmons whipping pastry, Statue of Liberty, long live the World Trade, long live the King, yo, I'm from the Empire State.
These streets will make you feel brand new. Big lights
Thanks.